Dialogue requires that we pay attention, that we develop and use our ability to observe. To be able to have true dialogue, we have to be able to use our ability to observe. And what do we observe? Well, we observe our thoughts, the words we speak, the feelings that we feel, our reactions to others, the reactions of others. We observe around the room, whoever is involved in the dialogue. How are people reacting to what we say? How are we reacting to what others say? In other words, we become a witness. It's like we come out of ourselves and we start observing. And this ability to observe is really what allows us to move away from our own positions at one point so that we can listen to the positions of others, so we can really hear others' perspectives, so that we can understand the points of view of other participants in the dialogue. Dialogue really is a win-win interaction where we are creating, we are innovating, we become with the mind, or our mind is wondering what is next, what is going to show up next, what is going to come up next in this conversation, what are we creating together? Remember, dialogue inspires innovation, and dialogue builds connection. As well, it builds trust, because the easiest way to break trust is to condemn someone, is to criticize someone, is to chastise someone, is to judge someone. This is the fastest way to break trust. And as I said before, companies and teams are asking, how do I build trust? What is the easiest, fastest, better way to build trust? And I'm not going to give you a solution. We're not talking about a solution. We're talking about a possibility that could open the channel of building trust. And it is dialogue. And again, when we become wondering about what other people have to say, and just wondering, but with excitement, with enthusiasm, with this desire to learn from others, then dialogue takes place, connection takes place, and trust takes place. Now, a concrete example of how dialogue could take place. And after we look at this example, then we go into the skills that help us to thrive during dialogue. And once we look at it from different perspectives, then, of course, in order to do that, we require certain skills. So let's look at this neutral event. Let's call it number 3. An event, anything. It is raining, something happened. Let's call this number 3 the neutral event. And let's look at this person here who is looking from a certain position. This gentleman is seeing what it will be perhaps a W. Let's look at these 3 people here from a different perspective. These 3 people are possibly looking at an E or something else. Let's look at this lady on this other side from a different point of view, and she is looking at what she might call an M. Or someone in one of the exercises said McDonald's. Of course, it made us laugh. And let's look at these 2 people here from a different perspective, and they are looking at a 3. What happens when we are not versed in dialogue is that each particular person or each particular position wants to defend their point of view. And when we are in positions where we don't want to let go, where we don't want to open up to see something different, where we don't open up to see why this person here sees a W instead of a 3, or why these 2 people here are seeing an E instead of an M. When we don't open up to look at the perspectives of other people, that's when we lose a lot of information, we lose a lot of wisdom from other people, we lose a lot of experience from other people, knowledge, ways of looking at situations, ways of solving problems, ways of coming to a better decision making, and so on. But why do we sustain our own position. And here is where, when we do this training, these conferences and these workshops and coaching, is when we become aware that sometimes we sustain positions only because of our ego, only because we think that our position is the best, only because we think that, or we assume that we need to be right. And this is what stifles dialogue. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Now let's look at the skills for creating dialogue. So let's start with awareness. And awareness is about being self-aware, looking at ourselves as opposed to looking outside ourselves. And this is one of the steps that we are emphasizing in all our training, on all our coaching, on all our personal development, on all our leadership and communication training. Because unless we become aware of where we need to make changes or emphasize or encourage anything that we want to learn, that we want to change, that we want to transform, is only temporary. So let's start with awareness, meaning paying attention. And that's what awareness really is paying attention to, number one, the words we speak. What do we say to ourselves? What do we say to others? What do we say in our mind? What do we think? The thoughts we think. What do we think when people talk, when people say something? What are the feelings? What do we feel when people express their opinions and maybe they are different than ours? What does it trigger in us? What are our reactions? How do we feel when people don't agree with us, when people have a completely different perspective than ours? What are our judgments? What do we assume? What do we judge? What do we criticize? Sometimes even inside, of course, with our thoughts, with our reactions. And look around. How do people react to what we say, to the words we speak, to the body language that we have? Very important, because all of these, what it does is that creates that space that builds trust, that builds safety for people to express openly, to express their opinions, to express their perspectives, and to really create the environment of true dialogue, a win-win perspective that comes from the abundance mentality. Very important to remember this. So now that we look at the event, metaphorically speaking, looking at a three from different perspectives and how different positions saw either a W, an M, a 3, or an E, let's now look at the skills and abilities that help us to thrive on the dialogue, or to apply dialogue, which is the ability to really go into understanding the different perspectives, not only understanding, but being able to see it from above, like the eagle vision. And the eagle vision, there is no coincidence why an eagle is the symbol of leadership, because an eagle flies very high, where he can see everything with an open-minded, with he has a vision that is 360 degrees. And really, from my perspective, wouldn't it be great to have a 360-degree vision where we can see not just one view, one way, one side, but when we can see and enrich ourselves with different perspectives. And believe me, it doesn't mean that we cannot have convictions, or that we cannot assure that the best decision is coming. What happens is that we open up to enriching a view that could give us even better decision making. And so here's what we're going to look at. The 4 skills that help us to thrive in dialogue. And let's start with the first one, which is suspending personal positions. As we looked in the graphic, when we attach to one position, we stop ourselves from opening up and understanding the positions of others, and therefore missing on a lot of information that others could have, experience that others could have, views of the world that others could have, and then stifled innovation and creativity. Number 2, identifying assumptions. What are our assumptions and what are the assumptions of others? What do they believe? What do they come from? What cultural assumptions do they have? What religious or political, spiritual assumptions do they have or do we have? And how we react to those assumptions? What are our reactions? So being observant of this and identifying assumptions to clarify. And I could give you many examples of, and just one little example. This is a very elemental example, but I'm going to give it to you. I was in a van with my grandchild, 3 years old, and he said, I am bored. And I only asked him, what does bored mean to you? And he says that I am hot, that the van is hot. Imagine, I had a different assumption of what the word bored meant, but he expressed what he meant by being bored. And this is what I mean identifying assumptions. It really helps us to clarify and to understand where others are coming from. Now, listening, really listening, is the key to perspective. Because when we listen with our mind, heart, and ears, then we really understand where others are coming from. When we listen with no judgment. Is it easy? Of course not. And do we let go of all judgments? Well, some people say this is impossible. And yes, I think it is impossible. However, we can have a pause. We can suspend. We can stop and put ourselves in a pause situation, in a pause conditioning, if you want, so that we can listen to others without having our, all of assumptions and our beliefs and our just desire to respond or to react, ready to just defend or to attack, just using a pause. And in fact, that's called emotional intelligence, but we'll talk about it later. And let's go into the last one, which was inquiry and reflection. And here is where we ask questions, and not to make ourselves better, but to understand the other person and reflect on what others say, how we react, what are our reactions towards what others say, etc. Now let's look at two types of communication. Let's look at dialogue and discussion and see how they are similar or different. Of course, you will find out that they are different. And let's look at the differences and how, when we look at the differences, we can appreciate why one or the other is used in a particular scenario. And here's what we can look at. Let's look at dialogue. Well, dialogue is created to inquire in order to learn. On the other side, discussion is to tell, sell, or persuade. That's the intention of a discussion. Let's come back to dialogue. The intention of dialogue is to unfold shared meaning. And we already mentioned that shared meaning is probably more, well, it has more perspectives, it has more points of view, it has more ways of looking at things. So obviously, from our perspective, is more valuable for innovation and creativity. Now, on the other side, discussion is, the purpose is to gain agreement from one meaning. Very, very narrow-minded, if you want, from our perspective. Now, let's look at dialogue. Dialogue, the purpose is to integrate multiple perspectives, whereas in discussion is to evaluate and select the best, and normally fairly soon. It's done fairly fast, and normally the evaluation, the perspective that is chosen is the one that is in power, or the person that yells or screams or speaks louder, unfortunately. Now let's look at a dialogue. The purpose of dialogue is to uncover and examine assumptions. And we already know what happens when we examine assumptions. We understand people in a very authentic way, more so than assuming and trying to make up assumptions of others when we don't even discover who they truly are or where they come from. Whereas let's look at discussion is to justify and defend assumptions. Remember, we are holding on to our position because we are right, because we have the best answer, and so our job is to justify and defend our assumptions. Let's move into dialogue again. It's to create an environment of trust and open expression of ideas in a soft manner, in a safe manner, and also soft if you want. And this is very important because many team leaders are now asking, how do I build trust? What do I need to build trust? And even in families, how do we build trust in a family? That's a very important issue. Now let's look at discussion. Discussion normally blocks self-expression as it could prompt fear of rejection, judgment, criticism, and often downplays the value of others, of other ideas, because it is the one that is in power, the one that believes he's right, or he or she is right, the one that has a bigger ego that gets hurt, and that's the downside of discussion as opposed to dialogue. Which one do we prefer? Which one is the most valuable? Which one needs to be used in a particular situation? That is to be decided, but decided with a conscious awareness. Now let's look at behaviors that support dialogue. And because dialogue is a way of communicating and is a really, I would call it a lifestyle, it requires certain behaviors, just as it requires certain mindset. So let's look at it. Let's go into, let me see here, the first one, which is the first behavior, which is a suspension of position or opinion of judgment. In other words, we already saw the example where we have the number 3 as the neutral event, and how we can suspend our judgment and positions. Now, when listening and speaking, we could do this. When we do this, not only do we get to listen to others, but others also start listening to us. And I think this is a very valuable point, is that sometimes it's not only necessary to listen to others, but to really create that environment where others want to listen to us. And this is one way. Let's go into number 2, which is to respect differences. And here is where we have the mindset that everyone has essential contribution to make. And it is to be honored for the perspective that only that person can bring. In other words, if someone comes from a different culture, different education, different background, different way of looking at the world, they will bring something that will enrich our way of looking at whatever it is that we're looking at, or whether we're solving a problem, whether we are creating something, whether we are resolving a conflict, or so on. Let's go into the next one, which is the role and status suspension. This is very important because it's very common that as part of a team, there will be someone who is a leader, or maybe in the family, someone who is in authority, or in a group, someone who perhaps believe that they have more power because they have more education, or have more money, or have more a better appearance, for whatever. We all know how ego works, and how some people will use ego to really use power over, or put others under power under. And this is when it comes, and I think it was in another video that I talked about, some of the blockages to have dialogue are either ego or intimidation. In other words, someone is intimidated by someone's power, or someone wants to really use their power during the conversations. I think I talked a little bit too much about this one, but it's a very important point. Let's look at the next one, which is balancing inquiry and advocacy. And it is expressing our own views and perspectives to make assumptions and relationships visible to others. In other words, not only are we there to question and to find out from others, but to really bring our perspective. And this is only possible, again, when the other 3 points are used in the dialogue session. Otherwise, we won't have the ability to express our opinion, or if we express our opinion, we're put down and shut up, or people are not paying attention. So yeah, it's a combination of all of these 4 that makes this happen. And finally, to focus on learning. This is a very important one, because unless we are focused on learning from others, which is really a humble attitude of a leader nowadays, or always, but more so talked about the new paradigm, when we are humble to know that we can learn from everyone, that everyone has something to teach us, something that we can learn from, then dialogue could happen. And again, this is about being humble, and humble in a sense of knowing that the more humble we are, the better decisions, the better solutions, the more innovation, the more creativity will take place, because this is a trite sentence, but two heads think better than one. And if we apply and if we adopt these behaviors, chances are we will be able to have dialogue with as many people as we meet. And this is really a trait of leadership. And why not? Let's apply it. All of us are leaders. And leader is someone who impacts the world without having to change others, but only looking at him or herself.